Business is simple. It's just not easy. We focus on three things to help you run and grow your business more easily: talent, sales, and how to scale. This is the Talent, Sales, and Scale Show. Hey everyone, Bryan Whittington with this episode of the Talent, Sales, and Scale Show. We have Seamus. Hopefully that we're going to keep his internet going on his Wi-Fi. Ruiz-Earle. He is the CEO of Carabiner Group. So I said, oh, so cool. You rappel in and save people in their Rev Ops. And he said, well, it's really about connecting people and doing the right things there. So pretty cool there. We're going to be talking all about Rev Ops. And I'm not 100% sure where this is going to be going, because there's one part with what Carabiner Group does with Seamus is you can take this as a fractional Rev Ops person, but then he's also one of the founding members of CEO Pavilion, which is all about sales training. And then there's so much that goes into Rev Ops of what's the most important part. So we'll see where this goes. But Seamus, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Bryan.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting some time aside. Now, the question I always like to ask to kick us off is, Rev Ops, it's a massive conversation, right? And you pointed out the fact that there's only 5,000 people right now that have the title Rev Ops. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah, 5,000 people and 8,000 open jobs. How remarkable is that?
Yeah, and the more curious thing is, I think a lot of people still don't even know what in the world Rev Ops is, right? So what I guess to start off there, you know, with most people not even knowing what Rev Ops is, why in the world should we listen to you, Seamus, on this topic?
It's a really, really good point. I mean, this is where you start looking back at the history of Rev Ops for your answer, right? About 2 years ago, there was a New York Times article saying, hey, folks, start paying attention to Rev Ops. It's coming down the tracks. Right? About a year ago, we started to see a renaissance of folks finding out what Rev Ops was and realizing that that was a competitive advantage if they embraced it. And now today, it's becoming so mainstream that folks know they need it without even knowing what it is. Right. And so big part about my job today as CEO of the Carabiner Group is education and evangelism, for lack of a better term, trying to get folks to recognize the value of revenue operations and what that function can actually mean for them. Right. The definition, which we can probably start with, is what we term as the confluence of sales, marketing, and customer relations, customer service. And particularly the systems that underlie all three of those things, making sure that all of your data runs together, that it's not siloed, and giving your C-suite the ability to make data-driven decisions that are ultimately going to affect your entire go-to-market motion and your entire customer journey. So that's why it's so important. It sits at the intersection of all three of those different very important components and works as sort of a navigator. Right, understanding where the rocks are to steer the ship in the other direction.
But there's so much that goes into that, right? So let's unpack that a little bit, because the confluence of sales, and by the way, I'm from Pittsburgh, so we love the word confluence. Not many people know that, right? So sales, marketing, and customer service, it's a pretty vague. I don't want to say vague. It's a pretty broad topic, those three areas. But then you said the platforms of the technology that really combines those, because there's so much in sales enablement tools and all of these other tools that are coming out. So whenever we look at this Rev Ops professional, one of those 5,000 or 8,000 top openings, what are some of the key skills, key characteristics that this Rev Ops person should have? Because it's one part data, one part technologist, one part salesperson, one part marketing person, one part customer success. I mean, that's a lot of parts there. So what are maybe the key elements that we should be looking for?
It's a very interesting conundrum to face, almost unique to Rev Ops, right? It's you're looking for, I would say, three things fundamentally. One is a technology component, right? And particularly a tactician. You need somebody, 9 times out of 10, you need somebody who can get into the weeds, put their hands on the keyboard and start developing systems for you and working through the tactical problems that you're facing as an organization and design, architect, implement solutions to fix them. And not even just design, and implement those systems, but they need to know what exists out in the marketplace, which is becoming increasingly more difficult as these systems pop up more and more, really truly innovative systems, but there's dozens of them, if not hundreds at this stage. So the folks need to be up to date on the technology landscape and know how to put it into place. Second, you're looking for a strategist. You're looking for someone who's been around the block many a time, right? And they need to know what they're doing fundamentally, so that when you hit your key inflection points, when you hit the, hey, I want to double this year or triple this year, and it's Q3 and you hit a roadblock, right? You need someone who can recognize the challenges that you're facing and rely on a backlog of historical data that they've amassed over a career to be able to design a strategy forward that will actually lead you to success, right? You don't want them guessing. In other words, you want them to rely on lived experience or learned experience to get you to that next stage. And finally, what I would say is that potentially one of the most important components is the high level of EQ. This person sits at the intersection of three very high stress, very high activity components of a business: sales, marketing, and service. And fundamentally, they need to be able to understand and empathize with the leaders of each of those departments, take all of that data together, synthesize it, and convey it to folks in a way that instigates action. And IQ is always an important component working in the business world, but EQ, particularly for this role, understanding how people work, think, empathize with them, that's a critical component as well.
So whenever we look at the technology part of this, is it somebody that would be able to code, that would be able to program, is it that level, or somebody that's more that could take that strategic approach, where if they're able to envision what that roadmap is, what that customer journey is, that flow of information, those steps of the process, would that be the technical part, even if they're not able to jump on the keyboard and do coding, for example? I mean, if you look at Salesforce, you need to be a programmer, for goodness sakes, oftentimes.
Yeah, so I started out as a Salesforce savant, if you will, right? I spoke at Dreamforce when I was 17. I was very much in that world, neck deep, right? And so one of the things I loved about Salesforce was that the clicks not code mantra, right? I actually still don't code today, and I'm able to design practically almost anything I need to in the Salesforce system. So what I would say is that you need someone who has the architect level skills, and by architect I mean someone who can build the blueprint and oftentimes have others execute on it, right? But in order to do so, they need to understand the technology, how it interacts with other pieces of technology, right? And really, it's almost like a very skilled mechanic, right? He doesn't need to necessarily, get up from his chair, right? But he's going to point you to the right tool so the junior can go over and grab it and put it into place. And that's a really important component. You got to understand those tools, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them at this point, really well, so you know which one to apply in which situation. And that's what I mean by a tactician.
So talk to me a little bit about architect, right? So, and from a non-technical background, which is me, right, guilty of that, unpack a little bit about what do you mean by architect? Because I had the sense, but I'd rather hear it from you as the genius here.
Yeah, well, architect has many terms. Sometimes they're very, very technical folks, and other times they act more like a physical architect, the ones that would build a building, right? In a previous life, I could have become an architect. I really enjoyed those courses when I took them, and one of the things that I learned was that they very much focused on conceptual thinking, right? They very much focused on, okay, this is the feng shui of the building, and this is how it's going to operate, and the movement is going to work, and this room is structured in this way for X, Y, and Z reasons. They're very critical thinker focused, right? And so that's what, from a technology perspective, it's a good analogy, right? You don't actually have to put hands and feet on the concrete and mortar, right? That's not necessarily the purpose of an architect, but the building itself, the system itself, gets designed to maximize the efficiency, to maximize the effort and the value that's going to be coming out of that particular project, and ultimately make the customer, or in this case, an internal client, successful. right?
So to feed this back to you a little bit, it would be a person that would know the flow of information, understand the layout of that UX UI design of what we'd ultimately want that to look like for optimum efficiency, lessons, keystrokes, or ability to find the tags, the keywords, or whatever we might be looking for within it. So they're able to lay all of that out because they know what the end goal is, can reverse engineer it from a conceptual standpoint to be able to then correctly convey that to whoever's going to do the nuts and bolts of creating this thing. Is that what we mean by architect?
Yeah, and I'd say that the last and certainly important component to architect is collecting and then synthesizing information from the stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
An architect doesn't design in a vacuum. They have to take into account the needs and the desires of the client. The same as in house building as it is in systems building.
And I think that goes to your third point, which is that high level of EQ, because you're going to likely have to deal with a lot of strong personalities. If you're dealing with a leader of sales, leader of marketing, maybe not so much in customer service or customer success, but likely, right? If you're in a leadership role, they're going to be fairly strong personalities, and they're all going to have their own perspective. And it's really going to be a challenge to bring those seemingly, that dichotomy between them, but seemingly opposing viewpoints sometimes because there's such different perspectives, bringing them together to compromise to get the best approach. So what have you found these people to be able to do, or I guess the background which has allowed them that EQ that would really thrive in this role? Well,
I would say that a similarly strong personality is certainly something to look for. Composure is the word that I would say, right? When you have a lot of information thrown at you from a lot of strong folks, there's a lot of different ways you can react to it. And one of the ones that I try to ascribe to is composure, receive the information, thank them for the information, and create your own solutions from that, right? Okay. Because fundamentally, a lot of the times folks will come to the table thinking they have the solution for their problem. It's, hey, going to the doctor's office, I looked up on WebMD, I know exactly what I've got, give me this medication, I'll be fine. Yeah. And that isn't the case, right? We all know that that's not how that works in that world, and it's the same thing in technology. 9 times out of 10, folks are going to miss the mark just a little bit, or maybe even a lot, right? And so rather than being an order taker, right, you need to understand where a person's coming from, understand the desires and the goals they're trying to solve, and then get all whatever details you need to out of the middle of that, really in a very inquisitive nature, to answer that question, right? To fundamentally get the solution that they need. And so again, from a critical thinking perspective, it's almost like you've got a whole bunch of things, scattered around in a ball pit or something, right? And you're trying you get all that information input, and you're going to need to sort through it to find those critical components from each of the departments, right? And then synthesize those together to make a solution that works for all three.
Yeah, so it would really be somebody that's able to take a bunch of disparate data, find the patterns, if you will, or the commonality, the intersection points, the confluence, if you will, to be able to pull all that information together and then feed it back in a way that those different stakeholders are going to be open to, let alone the users of whoever's using this are going to be open to actually doing. Is that kind of a good summary there?
That's it's almost like you've got three concentric circles stacked on top of one another, right? Yeah. And they might come in one right here, and another way up there or something, right? And your job is to take all of that information and really start to get it so that they overlap, right? Where you're able to kind of dig through it all and find the commonalities and then bring them all together to create your system. I think it's really an underrated skill set, right? Fundamentally, it's one that is more taught to historians than to computer scientists, frankly. I was a history and economics major in school, didn't do anything with computers, and yet I end up using that skill set far more often than I do the computers nowadays.
Well, it's a quick aside, and I'll bring it right back. With how tightly intersected customer success, sales, and marketing is right now, and with product development or whatever the case may be, how closely those are aligned. I would say that skill set needs to be in every single leader going forward, because we have to have, I mean, the thing that's, I think, killing most organizations is that siloing of information and getting people to share and dialogue and not be so constrained by their perspectives, their preconceived notions, right? That confirmation bias, and really open up to other ways of doing things. I think it'd be critical, especially for this role.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can take it down the path of that for a minute. There's something to be said for the education system in this country, right? I won't harp on kids shouldn't go to college, because frankly, I don't believe in that, right? I do think that university is a beneficial time for folks to get, exposure to different ideas and so on. But I think we need to be very candid and practical about the application of a college-based system, right? It should be, rather than for skills transfer, it needs to be for maturation, right, and development. Because right now, when we're looking at the skill sets that folks use on a daily basis in an ever-changing technology-based world, understanding specific technology sets, or focusing on a narrow skill set of pure focus-based learning is not serving the students well, right? And in fact, one could argue that it's putting them at a disadvantage in an ever-fluctuating job market, where it's an inch wide, mile deep mentality, rather than a true liberal arts education, which in turn can allow someone to be enabled with the skills to, I guess, teach a man to fish rather than giving a man to fish, right?
It's curious that you should bring that up, Seamus. Yesterday was at an innovation seminar, innovation meeting, and it's talking about all the different inflection points that we're getting to, where we're right now, we're going to start to see exponential growth or exponential change in healthcare and water treatment. And I mean, virtually everything that we know today, we're right at that inflection point as we're bringing AI technology and all of this. We're bringing technology into all of these ideas that, you go to the doctor, for goodness sakes, and you can't even get your medical records. They're giving you faxes, and who in the world has a fax machine these days? And so it's talking about, we're right at that inflection point, and the key to schooling right now is what you just said. It's learning how to learn. Because if you can't learn how to learn, if you can't learn how to really problem solve and get to the root cause challenge, I was kind of smiling to myself whenever you said these people are showing up with what they believe is a solution, and that solution is probably the band-aid to the problem, and they're not getting at the root cause. So I couldn't agree with you more. So I'll give you the last word on that, and we'll get back on the RevOps side.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my personal story is very much tied to that component, right? I started doing Salesforce at 17, as I mentioned, and I continued working full-time in that space all throughout university. Right. I did double major, history and economics, worked full time, right? And I loved school. I went to Boston College. It was fantastic, great professors, great education. But the physical skills that I learned in economics courses, how to, calculate a deadweight loss and do a weighted average cost of capital calculation, those components, I don't use that, right? And based off the valuations we're seeing today, and in most of the SaaS companies, I don't think anybody else does either, right? So, fundamentally, I use the skills that I learned in history, which has been taught for decades and centuries the same way, fundamentally, about critical thinking and how to absorb information and amalgamate it. And, I combine that with the self-taught experience of Salesforce to get to the point where I'm at today. And I think, as my final point here, folks need to be very, very clear and very concise about, hey, study for skills, right? Pick the majors that are actually going to get you the skills that you need moving forward. Specific, curriculums that are solely focused on one focus, I think ultimately set people up for failure and perpetuate to this cycle of, college debt and struggle for the next 10 years of their career.
Well, let's tie that into the person being able, this person must be able to keep up with this landscape. And it seems like the landscape is, at that inflection point too. There's so much new stuff coming out at you all the time. So this will be a two-part question. One is suggestions on how to keep up with it. And then two, when do you make a switch? Because that cost of change, whenever you're talking about RevOps, is brutal. So let's hit those two topics. So one, how do you keep up with it? And two, when do you change into a new platform whenever this one's good enough?
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic, right? I'd say, how do you keep up with it? You got to have a strong network around you, fundamentally, right? The reason why Carabiner is successful is we have 40 really, really qualified people who keep their, fingers on the pulse of the technology sector. They know the technologies, they evaluate them critically, continuously. And we know when the best one is coming out on the market. We know where the market's shifting, right? We have a whole analytics department focused on that sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So you need a network around you. There's plenty of really, really, really sharp, smart, qualified RevOps people out there who give very generously of their time and their energy from a content and mentorship perspective. Many of them inside my own team, many of them outside of my team, right? And I would encourage everyone to really get educated, right? Start listening to podcasts, start listening to or reading the articles, follow LinkedIn creators who focused on RevOps, because education, right, is and again, getting that data in and consolidating it in your own head, that's a critical component of staying up to date on RevOps. When do you make the change on a system? My philosophy is that RevOps should be a part of a company from pre-seed onwards, right? Particularly because of the ecosystem that we're in. Folks are so friendly. Folks are so willing to give mentorship. Even if you don't have the budget, someone will sit down with you for 30 minutes and give you they'll give you the teachings to move forward yourself. They'll give you the resources. Our philosophy is that it's going to be much less expensive to fix a problem if you do it before there is a problem. And so, for example, don't screw around on a cheap CRM from the beginning, right? Because later on, that's going to be $100,000 and 6 months to switch it over, right? If you can pull together the funds to pay for the entry level, version of Salesforce, it's probably going to set you up a lot better, because if you plan on growth, within 3 or 6 months of time of making that decision to go with Soho or go to Pipedrive or Monday.com, right, you're going to end up wanting to move, and then you're going to be stalled while folks are having to dive deep into that to get there. So I'd say making the right decision at the first time you're starting to think about this, not screwing around with the systems that you're working with, really trying, sometimes you don't have a choice, but when you do, going with best in class, right, tools, combining that with strategy, again, combining that with the leadership and the mentorship of those who are in the space, you're going to be much better set up than someone who's just trying to go at it, in the least expensive way, without mentorship, without leadership of the right ways of doing it.
So let's parse this out a little bit. What would you say the difference is? Now, obviously, your bias is going to be, hey, you should hire us. So let's give that bias out there right now. Sure. But nevertheless, it's a valid question. When should somebody hire within, have their own internal, and when should somebody outsource?
So it's interesting. You obviously call it my bias, and there certainly is one. I'm running a business.
We all have them, right?
So on. The funny thing is that of all the businesses I've ever come across, we are rather uniquely built out of an industry problem. If the problem ever goes away, I think so will we. And let me break that down for you. We are if you rely on the economics perspective, a fundamental supply and demand in equilibrium at this particular point in time. Supply of, even just using that example from before, 5,000 people with the director of RevOps title, and demand about 14,000 jobs in the US for those people. Right? That's really tough to resolve. Fundamentally, the math doesn't add up, right? 1-to-1 doesn't work there. And so what does that do? Well, in a traditional economics model, that means that price for that resource goes very, very high. We're seeing true, competent RevOps folks get hired for upwards of $300,000.
Wow.
Pretty challenging to manage, right? We're seeing supply try to get artificially fixed by introducing new folks into the marketplace without the requisite experience. So Salesforce admins who 2 years ago got into Salesforce are now being promoted into director of RevOps positions. And fundamentally, they don't have the skill sets yet, right? So they're really
they might know how to do the keyboard strokes, but they don't know how to do that strategic thinking and the problem solving.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
They can be foot soldiers, but setting the blueprint for a growing company with $40 million in funding, right? That's going to be something that you really want to think about. And so you've got really two challenges in that world, where one is, can you hire someone? Do you physically have the finances to hire someone qualified? If you don't, are you comfortable with having a junior resource who's going to be figuring it out as you go in what is arguably one of the most critical components in a growing company? And the third is that the technology landscape is expanding so fast that you're going to need to hire out anyways. If you have a director of RevOps, chances are they're not going to be tactical on keyboard. And so what you're going to end up going to is a firm similar to ours to actually implement the solution once it's set. And so to answer your question, fundamentally, when do you hire someone internally versus externally? If you can find the superhero, the one who I talking with Rosalind Santa Elena, probably the leader in the RevOps space today, she estimates there's less than 50 of them in the world, fundamentally, who have the true perfection across the entire ecosystem.
And those are those three characteristics that we talked about? Those are
the three at full maturation, right?
So you only have 50 people that are able to do the technology, the strategy, and the high level EQ?
We have 3 people who have perfected that. 3 people who can manage that at a Fortune 500, all the way from a fast growing Series A all the way up to a Fortune 500. And that's obviously peak state, right? If you can find one of those people, fantastic, right? Snap them up, get them in your door, however you can, right? I know I compete for them just as much as everybody else does. If you can find them, great. If not, you're going to have to rely on a team-based model, and then it comes down to economics, right? You can bring someone in internally to set the strategy, but you're going to need tacticians. You can bring in a tactician, but then you're going to need a strategist outside, right? Our proposal, right, fundamentally, is that we hire all of those people, right? And then when you need a HubSpot person, you get your HubSpot person. When you need your Marketo person, your Salesforce person, et cetera, they work with your strategist who's been assigned to you, who's learned your business, who does all of these things. And you get to fractionally share those resources across a wide pool of companies to diffuse the cost and make it affordable, right? Our goal fundamentally is to democratize RevOps, right? We got to fix this supply and demand problem somehow. And the way that we've managed to do that in the short term is give folks resources as they need them in an affordable way, rather than having to hire an entire team of resources full time.
Now, when should somebody, you're in California, right? So you're in the thick of it. Let's go out of California. Let's go out of Austin. Let's go out of Boston, right? And how do the mere mortals that don't have VC backed, right, that are trying to shoestring this, bootstrap this thing, how do they get started with RevOps?
Well, something is better than nothing, right? So this is where there's a couple of different methods, right? I'll defer to the easiest one first, right? Again, take an intern, take a competent person with skills, eager to learn, right? And set them down the path to being taught, right? Fundamentally, this ecosystem is very open to teaching folks who are eager to learn what they need to do. Our entire mentality on that front is that we're going to be taking freshmen in college and putting them on a learning path so that by the end of this path, they'll have 6 years of experience before they're out and fully on their own in the ecosystem. And that's a long time, right? That's a long time but we feel that we have to sow the seeds early in order to get the returns later. And I would argue that all of these companies out in the world need to be doing the same. Send the elevator back down is what folks term it as in the industry, right? We got to fix the supply and demand problem somehow. And fundamentally, it's going to be up to companies to sponsor that growth for their own organizations. So take someone junior, put them through learning paths, get them exposed to these things, give them opportunities to fail in a controlled environment, right? And learn from it. And slowly but surely, you'll be able to develop a RevOps person without having to pay, exorbitant amounts of money right off the bat.
Now, let's talk about some of those learning paths. What would you say the key focus, if I want to get into this, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is a great opportunity for me. I want to go work with Seamus and Carabiner, or I want to, do this on my own. What are maybe the pathways that I should start to think about to become this person?
Well, as an individual actor, there's a couple of different things you can do. One is there's a lot of free resources out there, like Salesforce Trailhead, HubSpot Learning Academies, right? Like there are things that you can do to become technically sound and educated, right? About the technologies that you'll be working with. And that's a good first step. Then you got to go in and start embracing the strategy components. Pavilion's a great example, right? Joining Pavilion, going through the RevOps school with Pavilion.
So let's pause there. Let's unpack that Pavilion RevOps, because you and I talked about it, but let people know what this is before we dive down more deeply on that.
Absolutely. So Pavilion is a members only collective that's focused on upskilling and advancing folks' career through cohort-based learning, right? And community building. So they teach all sorts of different courses, from CMO school to RevOps school to Sales Ops school to Intro to SDR school, right? Everything you can think of in kind of a B2B model that would be important. And they do it through a members only Slack group and learning platforms. So they combine that with in-person events and cohort-based learning and chapter-based community building. And it's a big part of how our company has managed to grow. Our team has managed to upskill, and literally thousands of others, across the world have managed to do the same.
Nice. Okay. So get into those communities. So whether it's like a Trailhead or HubSpot or whichever one, learn that. And so that's a lot of intentionality. You got to jump in there and do that, time block it, set it aside, and then also take advantage of some of these resources like Pavilion. And then that's where I cut you off. So keep going down that path, please.
Yeah. So, Pavilion offers schools like Intro to RevOps, right? Or Advanced RevOps school, right? And that's going to be focused primarily on, the strategy component, right? It's going to be learning how to synthesize that information, how to design the system architecture, how to do really that advanced level of thinking from the leaders in the space, from those 50, right? They're all plugged into those communities and they're all really, really passionate. 40 out of the 50 are like, their entire mission in life is to give back to the community and start teaching folks about this work, right? You got to think about it from the perspective of this is our life's work, fundamentally, right? This is what we get up every day, roll out of bed, and get to go to work to do. And for most of us, this imbalance is not something that we like. We would love it if, there was RevOps for everyone, because we think it's such a critical function, right? And right now that purely isn't the case. So a lot of us go through the efforts of talent development and mentorship to try and solve that imbalance and ultimately do well in the world, right? I mean, that's to the point before of if Carabiner one day is unnecessary, that's okay, right? I don't see that happening for the next 10 or 15 years, fundamentally, if not longer.
So why do you think RevOps is so important? I mean, because everybody will argue and say, sales is more important, marketing is more important. Why are you saying RevOps is really a key player, so important? Why are you passionate about this?
It's a compass. That's fundamentally what it is. You're in the middle of a fog of growing a business and you're trying to get to north. And the RevOps folks, they're taking in all of the different magnetic forces that are around you, right? Combining that with a map, right? And saying, that's the way you need to go. That's fundamentally what it is. Without RevOps, you're drifting through a fog. You're trying to make decisions based off of random gusts of air that are coming at you, right? and you don't know which way to turn your ship. And you can think that you do, right? But you don't have the data backing you to make a data-driven decision. Right? You've got all this data in all of these different silos, and RevOps, the goal, the function of RevOps is to take those data points, consolidate them, and ultimately make an educated decision moving forward that you can be secure about, that you're bringing your business in the right direction. And that's why it's so important. It's the only function across all three of those that takes the data points from all across the business, including finance in many instances, right? And gives that in a clear, concise way to make a decision off of. And that's why it's so important.
Now, how different, because we have revenue generation, operations, hence the coming together of RevOps, right? Plus there's technology and finance in there, so let's throw that in there. How different is a RevOps position or a RevOps worker than a regular operations person, right? Somebody in just your standard traditional operations.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because part of the focus for my team over the next year and a half, 2 years, is to educate folks outside of the B2B SaaS world on the role of RevOps in their organization. Because you're right, I started out in finance, and operations did a lot of what I'm talking about, right? In an investment bank, you've got a director of operations who's managing these things, and fundamentally they're doing very similar roles. And so what is the difference? And the difference, I would argue, is a mindset shift. That's really what it comes down to between operations and revenue operations, because that word, that revenue piece, means you're not just focused on the day-to-day running of an office, not just focused on the day-to-day runnings of a system. You're focused on the go-to-market motion, and you're focused on the customer journey, and you're focused on ensuring that that through line throughout all of these three things is focused not just making it run on peak efficiency, but also, and very importantly, focused on revenue generating activity. And so putting your role as an operations person into the guise of a revenue operations person, that's fundamentally a different mindset shift that's going to affect the actions and the components of your day-to-day activity. You're not just focused on building in a system that's going to fix your HR onboarding process. You're focused on doing it in such a way that's going to maximize customer retention or employee retention, maximize their ability to perform, maximize their time to value inside of an organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that they can, be the best, contributor to their teams.
So that brings up a good point. I mean, if you think about it, a RevOps person then could theoretically start to look at the HRIS system, because recruiting is nothing but sales. That's the revenue generation side also. So how much does this RevOps start to morph into? I mean, this could be really the key leader for the organization, because it used to be finance. It used to be a person in sales or marketing that comes up, but it seems like in the future, it would make logical sense that the RevOps has the pulse of every part of the business.
And that in lies, not to do, another shameless plug for the company, right? But that's fundamental. Like I said, it's built out of a problem, right? It's built out of a problem. What happens when that person leaves your company, right? We're seeing RevOps people jump on average from job to job every 14 months.
Holy cow.
Right? And so when you've got another offer down the road for $50,000 more, it's really tough to retain that person. And so
in 14 months, I mean, to really understand the whole architecture and the business acumen required for this, there's no way that you probably have it within 14 months completely. You're probably just starting to figure it out. But then two, to backfill it, I mean, that is a critically important role.
And that's where, they'll spend the first 6 months getting to know the business, next 6 months designing a strategy, following 2 months starting it, and then boom, they're gone, right? And all that tribal knowledge that you amassed over that time frame, the investment of that company, and this critical person is gone. They're working for your competitor. They're working for, another person, another company that isn't even related to you, right? And you're left rudderless in the middle of a squall, right?
Yeah.
And that's where, from a perspective of ours, right, we're coming in, even if it's just for 10 hours a week with this person, right, to be the keepers of the tribal knowledge. We know what the strategy was. We know what steps have been taken. We are documenting it all along the way. And we're not going anywhere, right? It's not in our best interest to. Right? We're going to be that continuity of government. Go find you another person full time, surge our resources in place to keep sure, keep everything moving down the road, right? We've got the qualified people. You don't have to spend 6 months trying to find someone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's built out of the market space right now. That's why it's structured the way it is, in that if you can't retain your talent, you're going to be, screwed fundamentally.
to put it lightly. All right, so we're checking out Trailhead and some of these other pieces. We're participating in Pavilion and some other communities. We're getting really good information and understanding operations and getting our business acumen up and rolling. How much LinkedIn Learning, is that another place to go for some of this stuff, or is it not there yet?
I would argue that there are probably nuggets of information out there. I'd say LinkedIn general is probably more so. Following those RevOps leaders, following people like Rosalind, following people like Jeff, the people who are out there putting out content about revenue operations religiously. You're going to be able to absorb through osmosis almost by reading that detail a fair amount of at least contextual information.
Okay. And so to get to the point where your team is, right? I want to be a member of your team, or the same ability as a member of your team from an internal company. What else would I need to do other than those couple of things that we've mentioned?
Being in the trenches is kind of the last component, right?
Yeah.
There is no replacement for hard work and trial by fire. Right. We at Carabiner run very much off of a meritocracy. So years in the job are not nearly as important as experience amassed and ability gained. So, it fundamentally is, you got to get exposure, right? We're always hiring, right? And we, again, have a very liberal take on talent in general, and that we think that we look for that EQ above everything else, and we can teach the rest. So there are other firms out there who are looking for talent all the time. There's companies looking for talent. And I would say being very honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't know when you're going into those organizations. Being candid with them even, right? About the fact that, hey, I'm going to need mentorship, I'm going to need development, but I'm willing to be here and learn and put the hard work in to get the results you need. And then being honest with yourself when you need the help. Right? You're going to fundamentally need the experience, right? And you got to start somewhere, but you don't want to tarnish your reputation or tarnish your ability by saying that you're something that you're not, right? And that is a very tempting thing to do in today's day and age.
And this is such a critical role. It's a true story on our end. When we started up, we overbuilt. Right. I didn't realize how complex what we were trying to build was. We overbuilt, and the person that I had in charge didn't know how to build it, but then also didn't know how to ask for help. And that really can put you behind. And to your point, if you start down a path and it's broken and you need to go back and rebuild it, it takes a long time to get that unraveled. And I mean, you basically need to start fresh while you're, it's like doing an oil change whenever you're screaming down the street at 70 miles an hour. And it's not easy. So yeah, if you don't know, ask, because this is too critical and important. I mean, you're going to hurt somebody.
Yeah, and that's where, it can be a dangerous and a scary function in many respects. And again, I would say there are resources there to help, right? There's teams like Pavilion, there's teams like our team, right, who fundamentally exist to help companies. We're a relatively, easy insurance policy fundamentally, right? Take a flyer on somebody, bring, a company like ours in for 10 hours a week, or even an individual actor not connected with us for 10 hours a week, and let them be a mentor to that person, right? The dividends will get paid out, right? Not only will you have loyalty from that person you took a flyer on, hopefully leading them to stick with your company for longer, right? You're developing them, you're developing the talent, you're creating, more knowledge that your organization is going to benefit from. Yeah.
Now, how could a company, or how should a company engage one like yours?
Yeah. So, we're all over the place in terms of ways to reach out to us, but www.carabinergroup.com, CAR.
Oh, I'm sorry, less about the contact info, and we'll get that
Okay.
in a little bit. Meaning, if I wanted to hire an outsourced company, because that communication is critical, right? Because there's more than just, there's a difference between delegation and abdication, right? So how does that company work best with an outsourced company?
Everybody does it differently, is the short answer. I would argue that there is a right way and a wrong way, and the right
Let's go the right way.
Look for someone who's going to stick around. Don't do things on a project basis if you can help it, right? In terms of fixing a problem with a Band-Aid versus going to the core problem, right? You need someone who's going to invest in you just as much as you're going to invest in them. And the problem with today's day and age is that imbalance, right? A lot of companies are focused on going after the quick buck, right? Give me 50 grand to solve this problem. Great, I'll solve the problem and I'll move on. And then you'll realize 3 months from now that wasn't actually the problem that you needed solved.
Yeah.
Right? And then you can come back to me, and by that time, my rates will go up to 75K. Right? And so you want somebody who's going to invest in you, stick around for the long term. And really, I would say the most important thing is have a long-term vision of this. Right? If you're going to embrace RevOps, this is an investment for the long term. And you're going to need someone from a systems design and integration perspective who understands the ecosystem and understands your business and wants to grow with you.
So then the person looking for a company should expect to long-term, whether retainer base or whatever the case may be, not just a tactician. So if you're looking for somebody just to throw tasks at, probably not the ideal situation.
You can do that for less expensive ways, fundamentally.
Yeah.
Right? We are charitably the leader in the RevOps as a service marketplace, right? But there are plenty of others out there who do Salesforce tasks, HubSpot tasks, etc. If that's what you're looking for, that's perfectly fine, right? It's not going to be high-level strategy work most of the time. It's admin work, and that has a place in an organization as well. Absolutely. But that's not RevOps. That's different fundamentally.
Interesting. Okay. Now, let's go to, whenever you see people trying to get into RevOps, maybe they've just started to uncover it. What are the biggest challenges or mistakes that you see people making? There's so many.
Yeah, it's I think that it starts with the education gap, right? So RevOps is traditionally mistaken with sales ops, right? And they're different fundamentally. Sales ops is focused, as the name suggests, on the sales function entirely, and RevOps is focused on everything else that we've talked about. And so I think that putting sales as the exclusive sort of center of your strategy or your deployments is an issue and a mistake that I see often. It's an incredibly important component, but it can't overshadow all of the other departments and their needs and the ways that they will be interacting with the systems. And so I guess to summarize, taking too narrow of a view of your organization and your plan is really where we see people making the biggest and most impactful mistakes.
Got it. Now, and how about maybe a best business hack for either hiring this person or maybe to take RevOps to drive sales or scaling the business? I mean, if you take one of those three from a talent perspective, sales perspective, or scaling perspective, what's one piece of advice that you might give?
So my advice on, and it's not necessarily RevOps specific, so bear with me, but I have a term called alternative talent.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that exists elsewhere, if I created it, I don't know. I've never actually looked it up, but alternative talent to me means hiring for ability rather than for resume. And I'll give two examples. Right? One example is a very impactful consultant that we have on our team who worked as a barista for 10 years and got the certs, got the tactical knowledge, etc. But didn't have fundamentally the experience in the trenches that you would need to be considered a true RevOps person. And so we talked with her, and fundamentally what we noticed was an extraordinarily high level of EQ. Right? You work in customer service for 10 years in an environment like that, you start to understand and empathize with people in a way that is very unique. And so we took that person in, put them through training courses, started to develop, and I can tell you charitably that they are developing faster than 90% of the other students that we put through our programs. Wouldn't have gotten a second look at most other organizations. And that is a critical failure of a hiring plan. If you're looking purely based off of degree or resume or whatever, and not actually talking with the human being on the other side of the table, I know it's hard, but everyone's talking about this, great resignation. I can't find people to stick with my organization. And sometimes I feel that you're just not looking in the right places. The second example, slightly more maybe easy to make the connection. We just hired a 22-year Navy SEAL who's retiring out of the service to come and join our team as a sales person. Never had any enterprise sales experience in the past. And you ask him, when have you sold anything before? And he's like, well, I haven't really. I've not worked in sales or anything like that. And particularly in the software space, that would be pretty much an immediate disqualifier, right? You might get a second interview because he's a SEAL, right? But fundamentally, people are looking for folks who have done it before and who don't need to get taught, right? But you start talking with this guy more so, it's like, oh yeah, well, I actually worked as an advisor to the 4-star general, who did X, Y, and Z, and I ended up lobbying Congress on behalf of the Spec Ops program. And I'm like, well, dude, that's sales, right? That's fundamentally what you're doing. It's like, oh yeah, well, I was in Pashtun and I was talking with the insurgencies there, convincing them to a ceasefire. I'm like, yeah, that's sales too, pal. That's exactly what that is.
Yeah.
Right. And again, not orthodox by necessarily, certainly alternative, right? But talent nonetheless. And so what I would say is that your business hack is finding people who don't fit the mold of what you're looking for necessarily, but have all the skills and the talents that you need inside your organization, and taking the flyer when you can and as you can with these folks, because ultimately I've found that they pay off far more than they don't.
Yeah, we call it success characteristics. And we've identified 10 success characteristics that salespeople, or I would argue really anybody, needs. And it gets into, are you trainable? Do you have that growth mindset? Are you gritty, right? Are you, for example, you working your way through college, doing all of that? You likely didn't have to, but you did it. So are you gritty? Do you have a positive expectation of winning? Or just a couple of examples, but that goes across all positions. And so I couldn't agree with you more. I don't even look at the resume. I look at the what their experience is to kind of get a backstory. And then we have the conversation, but you laid it out exactly. Hey, when you're doing this, that's negotiation, that's sales. And it's very easy to go along because that Navy SEAL has discipline, hard work, drive, fully expects to win and is going to carry that themselves really, really well. So wholly agree with that. Love it. Okay. That's a great takeaway there.